In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a cryptic letter warns Miss Jane Marple of a shadowy alliance lurking in the old manor. As charming strangers and coded secrets unravel, the sharped spinster uncovers a sinister smuggling ring. From whispered gossip to a daring trap, Miss Marple's keen wit faces danger head-on. Can she outsmart a cunning mastermind before the village falls to greed? A thrilling mystery of deception and justice awaits. Chapter 1: The Whisper in the Village. St. Mary Mead, that quaint and sleepy village nestled in the folds of the English countryside, had always been a place where time seemed to dawdle, as if reluctant to disturb the gentle rhythm of its inhabitants. Lives. The cottages, with their thatched roofs and blooming gardens, stood in neat rows along the high street, where the post office, the bakery, and the vicarage formed the heart of the community. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did, and where the smallest deviation from routine could set tongues wagging for weeks. On this particular spring morning, with the air carrying the scent of fresh lilacs and the distant bleating of lambs, the village was abuzz with a new topic of conversation, one that had already reached the keen ears of Miss Jane Marple. Miss Marple, with her snow-white hair neatly tucked beneath a sensible hat and her knitting needles clicking softly in her hands, sat in her usual spot by the window of her modest cottage. The window overlooked the high street, offering a perfect vantage point for observing the comings and goings of St. Mary Mead. Her sharp blue eyes, undimmed by age, missed nothing, not the hurried stride of Mrs. Price, the postmistress, nor the way young Tommy Pierce lingered too long near the bakery, no doubt hoping for a free scone. But today, it was not the usual village antics that held her attention. It was the arrival of a stranger, a man named Mr. Reginald Harrow, who had taken up residence at the old manor house on the edge of the village, a place that had stood empty since old Colonel Bantry's passing. The manor, a grand but faded Georgian structure, had long been a subject of local curiosity. Its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys loomed over the village like a silent sentinel, its windows dark and its gardens overgrown. When word spread that it had been let to a newcomer, the news rippled through St. Mary Mead like a stone dropped in a still pond. Miss Marple had first heard of it from Mrs. Bantry, her dear friend and the late Colonel's widow, who had called at the cottage 2 days prior, her face alight with excitement. "Jane, you'll never guess," Mrs. Bantry had exclaimed, settling into the chintz armchair with a rustle of her tweed skirt. "The manor's been taken. A Mr. Harrow, some sort of businessman from London, they say, and he's brought staff with him to associates, I hear. Isn't it thrilling, after all these years of its standing empty?" Miss Marple had smiled, her needles pausing momentarily. "Thrilling indeed, Dolly," she had replied, her voice soft but with a hint of curiosity. "And what do we know of this Mr. Harrow?" Mrs. Bantry, ever eager to share gossip, had leaned forward. "Not much, I'm afraid. Mrs. Price says he's terribly charming, with a fine suit and a motor car that cost a fortune. But there's something odd about him, she says. He doesn't talk much about himself, and he's been asking questions about the village old families, land boundaries, that sort of thing. And those associates of his, a young woman, rather nervous looking, and a gruff man who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else." Miss Marple had nodded, her mind already turning over the possibilities. Strangers in St. Mary Mead were not uncommon tourists, often passed through, and the occasional artist or writer sought the village's quiet charm. But a man renting the manor, with associates no less, was unusual. It suggested purpose, perhaps one not entirely benign. She had seen such things before, in her long years of observing human nature, and she knew that charm could hide many secrets. That morning, as she sat by her window, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the post. Young Elsie, the postmistress's niece, cycled up the lane, her basket brimming with letters and parcels. She dismounted at Miss Marple's gate, her cheeks flushed from the ride, and handed over a single envelope. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said brightly. "Just the one for you today." "Thank you, Elsie," Miss Marple replied, taking the envelope with a smile. It was plain, with no return address, and her name was written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. She waited until Elsie had pedaled away before opening it, her curiosity piqued. Inside was a single sheet of paper, bearing a brief, typed message. "Beware the shadowy alliance at the manor. They seek what is hidden. Trust no one." Miss Marple read the note twice, her lips pursing slightly. It was cryptic, yet it carried an unmistakable urgency. She folded the paper and tucked it into her knitting basket, her mind already racing. A shadowy alliance. It was the sort of phrase that might belong in a penny dreadful, yet she knew better than to dismiss it. In her experience, warnings, however vague, often held a kernel of truth. She resolved to keep a closer eye on the manor and its new occupants. The opportunity to do so came sooner than expected. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to pay a neighborly visit to the manor, armed with a basket of homemade scones as an excuse. She dressed in her best tweed suit, her hat pinned neatly, and set off down the lane, her walking stick tapping lightly on the cobblestones. The manor was a good 20-minute walk, past the church and the village green, and as she went, she noted the familiar faces of St. Mary Mead, Mr. Ellis, the shopkeeper, sweeping his doorstep, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, tending her roses, and young Tommy Pierce, still loitering near the bakery. Each nodded or waved, and Miss Marple returned their greetings with her usual gentle smile, all the while cataloguing their expressions and movements in her sharp mind. The manor's gates were open when she arrived, the ironwork rusted but imposing. The drive was lined with ancient yews, their branches casting dappled shadows on the gravel. The house itself loomed ahead, its windows catching the afternoon sun. Miss Marple knocked on the heavy oak door, and after a moment it was opened by a young woman with pale skin and anxious eyes. She wore a simple gray dress, and her hair was pinned back in a way that suggested haste rather than care. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said warmly. "I am Miss Marple, from the village. I thought it only proper to welcome our new neighbors. I've brought some scones." The young woman hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "Oh, I thank you. I'm Clara Grayson. Please, come in." Her voice was soft, with a slight tremor, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted toward the hall behind her. As if expecting someone to appear, Clara led her into a drawing-room that was grand but sparsely furnished, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and polish. A fire crackled in the grate, though the spring day was mild. Mr. Harrow emerged from a side door, a tall man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a suit that spoke of London tailoring. His smile was broad, his manner polished, But Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the faintest flicker of calculation in his gaze. "Miss Marple, what a delight," he said, shaking her hand with just the right amount of warmth. "Reginald Harrow, at your service. I'm told St. Mary Mead is a charming place, and you're one of its pillars." Miss Marple smiled modestly, settling into a chair as Clara brought tea. "Oh, I'm merely an old woman who enjoys her garden and her knitting. But I do like to know my neighbors. Tell me, Mr. Harrow, what brings you to our little village?" Harrow leaned back, his fingers steepled. "Business, mostly. I deal in antiques, and the Manor's isolation suits my need for quiet study. My associates, Miss Grayson here, and Mr. Tate, who's out at the moment, assist with cataloging and acquisitions." Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. "Antiques are fascinating. Old families, like the Grangers, who once owned this manor, often had treasures hidden away. Have you found anything of interest?" Harrow's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Not yet, but the manor is full of surprises. Old houses, you know, always a story or two." He changed the subject smoothly, asking about the village fair. But Miss Marple noted Clara's sudden stillness, her teacup trembling slightly. As they chatted, a small incident caught Miss Marple's attention. Clara, reaching for a scone, knocked her handbag to the floor. A folded paper slipped out, covered in what looked like a cipherose of numbers and letters in a grid. Clara snatched it up quickly, but not before Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in its details. She said nothing, merely commenting on the quality of the tea, but her mind was already at work. A coded note in the possession of a nervous young woman, in a house tied to a cryptic warning. It was a puzzle, and Miss Marple loved puzzles. The visit lasted no more than half an hour, and Miss Marple left with polite farewells, promising to return for the Manor's open house at the upcoming fair. As she walked back to the village, the spring breeze tugging at her hat, she turned the pieces over in her mind. Mr. Harrow's charm was practiced, too perfect, like the curate she'd once known who turned out to be a jewel thief. Clara's anxiety suggested fear, perhaps of her employer, or something more, and that no codes were not the stuff of innocent antique dealers. The warning about a shadowy alliance loomed larger now, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of curiosity, tempered by caution. Back at her cottage, she retrieved the anonymous letter from her knitting basket and placed it beside her armchair where she could study it later. The village was quiet now, the sun dipping below the hills, casting long shadows across the high street, and watched as a sleek black car, its plates obscured, rolled slowly past the Manor's gates and disappeared into the dusk. She made a mental note of it, recalling a similar car from a case. Chapter 2. The Manor's new guest. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished wooden floor. She sat at her small breakfast table, a cup of tea steaming gently before her, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered the cryptic letter that had arrived the previous day. Its words, written in a hurried scrawl, lingered in her mind. A shadowy alliance gathers in the heart of St. Mary Mead. Trust no stranger. The postmark was local, the paper cheap, and the handwriting unfamiliar. Yet it carried an urgency that piqued her curiosity. Miss Marple, with her keen sense for the undercurrents of village life, knew that such warnings were rarely without cause. St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and winding lanes, was not accustomed to strangers, least of all those who took up residence in the grand, if somewhat dilapidated, Chalcot Manor. The manor, perched on a low hill overlooking the village, had stood empty for years, its ivy-clad walls and shuttered windows a silent testament to its faded glory. The arrival of Mr. Harrow, the new tenant, had set tongues wagging at the post office and the village shop. He was a man of indeterminate age, described variously as distinguished or aloof, with a penchant for tailored suits and a habit of keeping to himself. Miss Marple, ever observant, decided it was time to pay a neighborly visit. After all, she reasoned, a cup of tea and a few well-chosen questions could reveal more than a week of gossip. She chose a simple navy dress and her best hat, a modest affair adorned with a single feather, and set out with her wicker basket, ostensibly to deliver a jar of her homemade gooseberry jam. The walk to Chalcot Manor was pleasant, the air crisp with the promise of autumn, the hedgerows alive with the chatter of sparrows. As she approached the manor's wrought-iron gates, she noted the fresh tire tracks in the gravel drive, suggesting recent visitors. The gates creaked as she pushed them open, and she made her way up the path, her sensible shoes crunching softly. The manor's front door, heavy oak with a tarnished brass knocker, loomed before her. She rapped twice, the sound echoing in the stillness. After a moment, the door swung open to reveal a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with pale blonde hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that darted nervously. She wore a plain gray dress, and her hands fidgeted with a handkerchief. "Good morning," Miss Marple said brightly, her smile warm but her eyes sharp. "I'm Miss Marple, from the village. I thought it only proper to welcome the new residents with a small gift." She held up the jar of jam, its label neatly handwritten. The young woman hesitated, then offered a tentative smile. "Oh, how kind. I'm Clara Wren. Please, come in. I'll fetch Mr. Harrow." Miss Marple stepped into the entrance hall, her gaze sweeping over the high ceilings, the faded tapestries, and the grand staircase that curved upward into shadow. The air smelled of old wood and wax polish, with a faint undercurrent of something sharper, perhaps tobacco or chemicals. Clara disappeared through a side door, her footsteps quick and light, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to study her surroundings. A heavy oak table stood against one wall, cluttered with papers and a silver cigarette case. Above it hung a portrait of a stern-looking man in Victorian attire, his eyes seeming to follow her. Moments later, Clara returned, accompanied by a tall man with slicked-back dark hair and a neatly trimmed mustache. His suit was impeccably tailored, his smile polished, but there was a guarded quality to his eyes that Miss Marple noted at once. "Miss Marple, how delightful," he said, extending a hand. "Reginald Harrow. I'm charmed to make your acquaintance. Clara tells me you've brought us a gift." "Only a trifle," Miss Marple replied, handing him the jam. "I live in Mead Cottage, just down the lane. We're a close-knit village, Mr. Harrow, and we like to make newcomers feel at home." Harrow's smile widened, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Most kind. Would you care for tea? Clara, do see to it, will you?" Clara nodded and hurried off, leaving Miss Marple alone with Harrow. He gestured toward a drawing-room off the hall, its furniture shrouded in dust sheets except for a single sofa and a low table. They sat, and Miss Marple launched into her usual repertoire of village anecdotes. Mrs. Bantry's prize roses. The vicar's new sermon series, watching Harrow's reactions closely. He listened politely, nodding at the right moments, but his fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. Chalcott Manor has such history. The last tenants, the Grangers, were here for generations. Such a pity about their son, though. A tragic loss. Harrow's fingers stilled. Oh, I'm afraid I know little of the previous occupants. I leased the manor through an agent in London. Needed a quiet place for my work. And what is your work, Mr. Harrow, if I may ask? Miss Marple's tone was light, but her eyes were keen. Imports and exports, he said smoothly. Antiquities, mostly. I deal in rare objects for private collectors. It requires discretion, you understand. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. Discretion is so important in such matters. Before Harrow could respond, the door opened, and Clara returned with a tea tray, followed by a stocky man in a dark suit. His face was ruddy, his manner brusque, and he carried himself with the air of someone accustomed to giving orders. Harrow introduced him as Mr. Tate, his business associate, who gave Miss Marple a curt nod before taking a seat. Miss Marple was just telling me about the village, Harrow said, his tone genial. It seems a charming place, Tate grunted, his eyes narrowing. Quiet. Miss Marple's smile didn't falter. Oh, St. Mary Mead is very peaceful, Mr. Tate. Though we do take an interest in one another, it's only natural. Clara set the tea tray down, her hands trembling slightly. As she reached for the teapot, a small folded paper slipped from her sleeve and fluttered to the floor. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught it, but Clara didn't seem to notice. Harrow and Tate were discussing something about a shipment, their voices low, and Miss Marple seized the moment. She leaned forward, as if to adjust her shawl, and deftly scooped the paper into her basket, covering it with her handkerchief. Clara, dear, you've gone quite pale, Miss Marple said kindly. Are you feeling well? Clara started, her cheeks flushing. Oh, I'm fine, thank you. Just a little tired. Moving to a new place can be exhausting, Miss Marple said sympathetically. I remember when my nephew Raymond moved to London, such a flurry of activity. She continued chatting, steering the conversation to harmless topics, but her mind was on the paper in her basket. It was small, folded tightly, and she could just make out a series of numbers and letters scrawled across it. A code, perhaps. Her curiosity burned, but she maintained her composure, sipping her tea and nodding as Harrow described his plans to restore the manor's gardens. The visit stretched on for another half-hour, with Tate growing increasingly impatient and Clara hovering nervously. Miss Marple took her leave, promising to return with a recipe for her jam, and made her way back down the gravel drive. Once out of sight, she paused by a hedgerow and unfolded the paper. It read 23174 VHT, midnight, VH. The numbers and letters meant nothing to her yet, but the word midnight suggested a clandestine meeting, and VH, could it stand for Village Hall? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple spread the paper on her table, her knitting forgotten. She recalled the case from years ago, when a coded message had led to the discovery of a poaching ring in a neighboring village. Codes, she knew, were often simpler than they appeared, relying on context to unlock their meaning. She jotted down possible interpretations, her mind racing. Was Clara involved in Harrow's business, willingly or otherwise? And what of Tate, with his blunt manner and watchful eyes? The afternoon passed in quiet reflection. broken only by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, her friend and confidant, who burst in with news. "Jane, you'll never guess. I saw a car leaving the manor last night after midnight. Mind you, no lights, and the number plate was covered with mud. Most peculiar." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Peculiar, indeed, Dolly. Tell me everything." As Mrs. Bantry recounted her sighting, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the coded note. The manor, it seemed, was a hub of activity, and not the sort that welcomed neighborly scrutiny. She resolved to keep a close watch on Chalcot Manor, her instincts telling her that Clara's nervous demeanor and the mysterious note were pieces of a larger puzzle. The shadowy alliance hinted at in the letter was taking shape, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and razor-sharp mind, was determined to uncover it. The days that followed were filled with subtle inquiries. Miss Marple visited the village shop, chatting with the postmistress about recent deliveries to the manor. She learned that parcels arrived weekly, often late at night, addressed to Harrow but signed for by Tate. At the church, she spoke with Reverend Clement, who mentioned seeing Clara at the village hall, lingering near the notice board, as if waiting for someone. Each tidbit added to Miss Marple's mental tapestry, a web of connections she wove with care. Chapter 3. The Tuesday Club Revival. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a warmth that belied the chill of suspicion creeping through its lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered the cryptic letter that had arrived 2 days prior. Its words, scrawled in a hurried hand, spoke of a shadowy alliance threatening the peace of her beloved village. To anyone else, it might have seemed a prank, a fleeting jest, but Miss Marple's keen mind, honed by years of observing human nature, sensed something deeper. The letter, coupled with the whispers about the new occupant of the old manor house, Mr. Harrow, stirred her curiosity, and she intended to tug at it. The idea of reviving her old Tuesday night club had come to her that morning, a spark ignited over tea and toast. The club, a gathering of trusted friends who once shared tales of unsolved mysteries, had been dormant for years, but its spirit lingered in Miss Marple's memory. It was the perfect setting to sift through the village's rumors, to lay out the pieces of this new puzzle and see what patterns emerged. She had sent out invitations discreet, handwritten notes delivered by the butcher's boy to a select few, Reverend Leonard Clement, whose sharp mind often cut through moral dilemmas, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose lively imagination was matched only by her loyalty, Dr. Haydock, the village physician with a knack for noticing what others missed, and Miss Weatherby, whose penchant for local history often unearthed forgotten connections. The fifth guest, Colonel Bantry, had been included at his wife's insistence, though Miss Marple suspected he'd spend much of the evening napping by the fire. As the clock struck 6, the guests began to arrive. Miss Marple's cottage, with its low ceilings and rose-patterned wallpaper, felt alive with the hum of anticipation. The drawing-room was modestly furnished, its charm lying in its coziness, a chintz-covered sofa, a polished oak table, and a hearth where a small fire crackled against the autumn chill. A tray of scones, jam, and clotted cream sat beside a steaming teapot, the scent of Earl Grey mingling with the faint lavender of Miss Marple's sachets. She had arranged the chairs in a loose circle, ensuring everyone could see one another. Deliberate choice. His cassock was slightly frayed at the cuffs, a testament to his dedication to the parish over personal vanity. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm but tinged with curiosity, "your note was most intriguing. I trust this isn't merely a social call." "Not entirely, Leonard," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "But we'll wait for the others before I explain." Mrs. Bantry swept in next, her hat adorned with an extravagant feather that bobbed as she spoke. "Jane, you've got us all in a tizzy. Is it true about that Harrow fellow? They say he's got secrets thicker than my cook's gravy." Colonel Bantry followed, grumbling about the early hour, but softening at the sight of the scones. "Hope this is worth leaving my armchair for," he muttered, though his wife's nudge silenced him. Dr. Haydock arrived shortly after, his medical bag tucked under his arm, as if he expected a patient rather than a mystery. Miss Weatherby, the last to arrive, carried a small notebook, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if cataloguing every detail for posterity. Once they were seated, Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements precise yet unhurried. She let the conversation drift to village matters, the harvest festival, the new postmistresses, efficiency, knowing that the best revelations came when people felt at ease. Only when the teacups were filled and the scones half-eaten did she steer the discussion to the matter at hand. "Nightclub. You'll recall how we used to share stories, puzzling out mysteries together. Well, I believe we have a new puzzle in St. Mary Mead, and I'd value your thoughts." She reached into her knitting bag and produced the letter, its edges slightly creased from her careful handling. "It's unsigned, but it speaks of a shadowy alliance threatening our village. I'd like you to read it and tell me what you make of it." The Reverend adjusted his glasses and read aloud, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "Beware the shadowy alliance that gathers in the dark. They move unseen, their purpose cloaked, but their threat is real. St. Mary Mead is not as it seems." A hush fell over the room. Mrs. Bantry's feather quivered as she leaned forward. "Good heavens, Jane, that's positively chilling. It sounds like something out of one of Raymond's detective novels." Colonel Bantry snorted. "Sounds like nonsense to me. Probably some bored schoolboy playing a prank." "I'm not so sure," Dr. Haydock said, stroking his chin. "Anonymous letters often hide a kernel of truth. Have you any idea who sent it, Miss Marple?" "None," she admitted, "but its arrival coincides with certain developments in the village. You've all heard the talk about Mr. Harrow, the new tenant at the manor house." "Oh yes," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "They say he's frightfully rich, but no one knows where his money comes from. Mrs. Price, at the post office, swears he receives telegrams daily, all in code." Code. Miss Weatherby's pen paused over her notebook. "That's intriguing. In my research on the manor's history," Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But let's focus on what we know. Mr. Harrow arrived a fortnight ago, renting the manor from Lord Harborough, who's abroad. He's been seen with 2 associates, a young woman named Clara, who seems nervous, and a Mr. Tate, who strikes me as rather brusque." "I met Tate in the village shop," Dr. Haydock said. "He was buying quantities of tinned food, far more than 3 people would need." "Odd, don't you think?" "Very," Miss Marple agreed. "And then there's the manor itself. Mrs. Bantry, you mentioned seeing lights there late at night. Last week I was walking the dogs. Arthur insists on a late stroll, and I saw lights flickering in the manor's upper windows. It was past midnight, and there was a car parked in the lane, no lights on, just sitting there. Colonel Bantry rolled his eyes. You and your imagination, Dolly. Probably just a servant cleaning up. Servants don't clean at midnight, Mrs. Bantry retorted. And I'm sure I heard voices low, like they didn't want to be heard. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. The letter, the coded telegrams, the late-night light-sit, all pointed to something clandestine. She thought of her nephew Raymond's stories about espionage. With its thatched cottages and sleepy lanes, was no stranger to intrigue, as she'd learned over the years. Let's consider the letter's warning, she said. A shadowy alliance suggests a group, perhaps organized, with a purpose they wish to conceal. Mr. Harrow and his associates are the most obvious newcomers, but we mustn't overlook the villagers. People can hide their true natures, even those we've known for years. Reverend Clement frowned. You suspect someone local is involved. It's possible, Miss Marple said. Human nature is predictable in its unpredictability. I recall a case in Little Paddocks years ago where a trusted neighbor turned out to be a smuggler's accomplice. We must keep our minds open. The group fell silent, each lost in thought. She encouraged her guests to share their observations, knowing that even the smallest detail could be significant. Miss Weatherby spoke first. I've been researching the manor's past owners. It was a hub for black market goods during the war, food, fuel, even jewelry. The old caretaker, Mr. Grayson, used to tell stories of secret meetings in the cellars. That's useful, Miss Marple said. History often repeats itself. Dr. Haydock, have you noticed anything unusual in your rounds? The doctor hesitated. Well, there's been an uptick in minor injuries, cuts, bruises among the farmhands near the manor. I wondered if they'd been in a scuffle. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And you, Reverend? Reverend Clement smiled wryly. Nothing so formal, but Mrs. Price did mention a stranger asking about the manor's layout at the post office. She thought it odd, as most visitors don't care about the old place. The conversation flowed, each guest adding a thread to the tapestry of suspicion. Mrs. Bantry recounted a rumor about Mr. Harrow's wealth coming from foreign investments, while Colonel Bantry, reluctantly drawn in, admitted he'd seen a man loitering near the manor's gates, though he'd thought little of it at the time. Miss Marple listened, her mind sorting and sifting, drawing parallels to cases she'd solved before: blackmail scheme in Chipping Cleghorn, a theft in Much Benham. Each time, the key had been in the details, the small inconsistencies that others overlooked. Chapter 4. A glimpse in the dark. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, the kind that made one pull their shawl tighter and quicken their step toward the warmth of home. Miss Jane Marple, however, sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes fixed not on the intricate pattern of wool, but on the shadowed lane leading to the old manor house. The village had settled into its nightly hush, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant bark of a dog. Yet something in the atmosphere felt amiss, a subtle tension that Miss Marple's keen senses had learned to detect over years of observing human nature. Earlier that day, Mrs. Bantry had paid her a visit, her face flushed with the excitement of gossip. I swear, Jane, she had said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, I saw cloaked figures near the manor, moving like ghosts in the moonlight. 3 of them, at least, skulking by the hedgerow. I was out walking Dollypore. Thing needed a stretch after supper and there they were, just beyond the gate. I didn't dare linger, but I'm certain they were up to no good. Miss Marple had listened intently, her mild blue eyes betraying none of the curiosity that stirred within her. Cloaked figures, you say, she had replied, her tone as gentle as ever. How very curious. And at what hour was this, Dolly? Past 10, I'd say. The moon was high, and I could just make them out. They didn't see me, thank heavens. But what could they be doing? It's not as if the manor's been a hub of activity since old Mr. Grayson passed. Miss Marple had nodded, offering a reassuring smile. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light, dear. One never knows in a village like ours. Mrs. Bantry had left, mollified, but still buzzing with the thrill of her discovery. Miss Marple, however, was far from dismissive. The manor house, newly occupied by the enigmatic Mr. Harrow and his associates, had already piqued her interest. The cryptic letter she had received 2 days prior, with its vague warning of a shadowy alliance, had set her mind to work. Now, Mrs. Bantry's tale of cloaked figures added a new thread to the tapestry she was beginning to weave. As the clock on her mantel struck 9, the lane outside was dark, the manor's silhouette barely visible against the starry sky. She had positioned her chair to afford a clear view of the road, a habit born of years spent noticing what others overlooked. Her cottage, modest and ivy-clad, sat at the edge of St. Mary Mead, close enough to the manor to observe its comings and goings without drawing attention. Tonight, she felt, might yield something worth seeing. The village was no stranger to secrets. Miss Marple recalled a case from years ago, when smugglers had used the coastal routes near St. Mary Mead to ferry contraband under cover of night. The signs had been similar then: strangers in the village, hushed conversations, and vehicles moving without lights. The manor, with its sprawling grounds and secluded location, would be an ideal hub for illicit activity. And Mr. Harrow, with his polished charm and evasive answers, struck her as precisely the sort of man who might orchestrate such a scheme. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a low hum, like the purr of an engine. She leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. A car emerged from the manor's drive, its headlights off, its shape a dark blur against the hedgerow. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. She strained to make out its details, but the license plate was obscured, either by design or by the darkness. The vehicle disappeared around a bend, leaving only the faint crunch of gravel in its wake. Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing. A car without lights, leaving the manor at such an hour, was no innocent errand. She reached for her notebook, small, leather-bound volume she kept for such occasions, and jotted down the time and a brief description of the event. Black saloon, no visible plates, 9:07 p.m., she wrote, her handwriting neat despite the dim light. She added a question mark, a silent acknowledgement of the puzzle's growing complexity. The next morning, St. Mary Mead bustled with its usual rhythm. The post office was abuzz with chatter. The butcher's shop emitted the sharp scent of fresh meat, and children darted through the square, their laughter mingling with the clatter of a milk cart. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, made her way to the village shop, her basket swinging lightly at her side. She had no particular need for groceries, but the shop, run by Mr. Ellis, was a hub of gossip, and she intended to listen. Mr. Ellis, a wiry man with a perpetual frown, was behind the counter, sorting through a stack of invoices. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his tone curt but polite. "Need anything special today?" "Oh, just a few odds and ends," she replied, her voice warm. "Some tea, perhaps, and a tin of biscuits." As she browsed the shelves, she kept an ear on the conversation at the counter. "I heard that young woman, Clara, hasn't been seen in days," Mrs. Price said, her voice low but eager. "My Tom saw a van deliver something just last night." "Parcels, you say?" Miss Hartnell's eyebrows shot up. Tom couldn't see what was inside, but he said the driver looked shifty. Didn't even stop to chat, just handed them over and drove off. Miss Marple, pretending to examine a jar of marmalade, filed the information away. Parcels at odd hours. A car with no lights. The manor loomed in the distance, its chimneys just visible above the trees. She resolved to pay another visit, perhaps under the guise of returning a borrowed book to Mrs. Bantry, who had promised to accompany her that afternoon. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry walked the short distance to the manor, their steps measured, but purposeful. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for adventure. The manor's gates were open, and the gravel drive crunched underfoot as they approached the front door. A maid, young and nervous, answered their knock, and ushered them into the drawing-room, where Mr. Harrow awaited. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, what a delight," he said, rising from an armchair. His smile was as polished as ever, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in his eyes. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Oh, just returning your book," Mrs. Bantry said, brandishing the novel with a flourish. "And we thought we'd see how you're settling in. The manor's been empty so long. It's quite a change to have it lively again. A few of us. Would you care for tea?" They accepted, and the maid bustled off to prepare it. Miss Marple's eyes wandered the room, taking in the heavy drapes, the polished furniture, and the faint scent of tobacco that lingered in the air. A side table held a stack of papers, and she caught a glimpse of a map before Mr. Harrow casually moved to block her view. "You must find the village charming," she said, her tone light, "though I imagine it's quieter than you're used to." "Indeed," he replied, his voice smooth, "but there's a certain peace in it, a place to think, to plan." Mrs. Bantry pounced on the word, her eyes gleaming. "Are you planning something grand, Mr. Harrow?" He laughed, a sound that rang just a touch too loud. "Nothing so exciting, I'm afraid, just business matters. You know how it is always something to organize." The tea arrived, and the conversation turned to mundane topics: the weather, the village, fate, the state of the roads. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind elsewhere. She noted the absence of Clara and Mr. Tate, though she refrained from asking about them. Instead, she steered the talk toward the manor's history, hoping to glean some clue. "This house has seen its share of stories," she said. "I recall a time, years ago, when smugglers used the coast nearby. The village was quite abuzz then." Mr. Harrow's cup paused midway to his lips. "Smugglers? How intriguing. I assure you, we're far too dull for such things." "Oh, I'm sure," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "Just an old woman's reminiscing." They left soon after, with Mr. Harrow escorting them to the door. As they walked back to the village, Mrs. Bantry, was full of chatter. Did you see how he reacted when you mentioned smugglers? I'd wager he's hiding something, Jane. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. But we mustn't jump to conclusions. Observation, Dolly, is the key. We watch, we listen, and the truth reveals itself. That night, Miss Marple resumed her vigil by the window. The car appeared again, just past 10, its movements as stealthy as before. This time, she noted a second vehicle following at a distance, its lights also off. The two cars vanished into the night, and she added the detail to her notebook. The pattern was becoming clearer, but the purpose remained elusive. Smuggling, perhaps, or something more sinister. The cryptic letter's warning echoed in her mind. A shadowy alliance threatening the village. She thought of Clara's coded note, still tucked safely in her drawer, and resolved to study it further. The following days brought more whispers. The postmistress mentioned a stranger asking for directions to the manor, only to leave abruptly when pressed for details. The butcher's boy reported hearing odd noises, clanks, and thuds from the manor's grounds at night. Miss Marple listened to each report, her expression serene, but her mind cataloging every detail. She visited the village library, poring over old records of the manor and its previous occupants. A name caught her eye: Granger, a family that had lived nearby decades ago, their son lost under mysterious circumstances. Could there be a connection? On the fourth night, Miss Marple's patience was rewarded. She had taken to sitting in the dark, her lamp extinguished to avoid drawing attention. At 10:30, the car appeared again, but this time it stopped just beyond the manor's gate. Two figures emerged, their shapes indistinct, but their movements hurried. They carried something, a crate, perhaps, or a heavy baggin, disappeared into the hedgerow. Miss Marple's heart raced, but she remained still, her eyes straining to follow them. A third figure appeared, standing by the car, and for a moment the moonlight caught his face. It was Mr. Tate, his expression grim. The figures returned, empty-handed, and the car sped off. Miss Marple waited until the lane was silent before lighting her lamp and adding to her notebook. 3 figures, one identified as Mr. Tate, carrying crate or bag, 10:32 p.m., she wrote. She underlined the word crate, her mind turning to the possibility of stolen goods or contraband. The manor was no mere residence. It was a hub, a nexus of activity that the village had yet to fully grasp. The next morning, she called on Reverend Clement, whose rectory overlooked the manor's northern boundary. "Good morning, Reverend," she said, her basket brimming with apples as a pretext for her visit. "I thought you might enjoy these from my garden." "Very kind, Miss Marple," he said, ushering her inside. "You're looking thoughtful today. Something on your mind?" she smiled, settling into a chair. "Oh, just the usual village goings-on. I've been wondering about the manor. Have you noticed anything unusual from your window? You have such a fine view of the grounds." The Reverend hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Now that you mention it, I did see something odd a few nights ago. Lights flickering in the woods beyond the manor. I thought it might be poachers, but it was too deliberate, like a signal." "A signal," Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft. "How very interesting. And did you see anyone?" "No, it was too dark. But I mentioned it to Mr. Ellis at the shop, and he seemed awfully keen to change the subject." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her thoughts turning to Mr. Ellis. His name had surfaced too often for coincidence, first in the gossip about parcels. Now in his reluctance to discuss the manor, she decided to pay another visit to the shop, this time with a more pointed purpose. As she walked, she passed the village hall, where preparations for the upcoming charity event were underway. Banners fluttered, and women bustled about, arranging tables and chairs. Miss Marple paused, her eyes scanning the scene. The hall, centrally located, would be an ideal place for a discreet meeting or an exchange. At the shop, Mr. Ellis was as brusque as ever, his hands busy with the delivery of canned goods. "Back so soon, Miss Marple," he said, barely glancing up. "More tea?" "Not today, thank you," she replied, her tone cheerful. "I was wondering if you'd heard anything about the manor. There's talk of strange goings in the woods, cars at odd hours." His hands stilled, and for a moment his eyes met hers. "Village gossip," he said, his voice flat. "Always something to stir up. I wouldn't put stock in it, of course," she said, smiling. "But one does wonder. The manor's so quiet by day, yet the nights seem lively." He grunted, returning to his work. Miss Marple lingered a moment, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers fumbled with a tin. She thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. Mr. Ellis was involved, she was certain, but to what extent? Was he a pawn or something more? That evening, she sat by her window again, her knitting untouched. The lane was quiet, but her thoughts were anything but. The pieces were falling into place, the cloaked figures, the car without lights, the crates, the lights in the woods. She recalled the coded note from Clara's bag, its symbols still a mystery. Tomorrow she would consult her nephew, Raymond, who had a knack for puzzles. For now she watched and waited, her eyes fixed on the darkness, where the manor's secrets lay hidden, waiting to be unraveled. Chapter 5. The Curious Disappearance. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of the village's familiar cottages and the spire of St. Mary's Church. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, her toast untouched, her mind preoccupied with the peculiar events surrounding the manor's new occupants. The cryptic letter, the coded note she had glimpsed falling from Clara's bag, and the whispered rumors of nighttime visitors at the manor swirled in her thoughts. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by age, flickered toward the window, where the world outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next clue to emerge. Clara's sudden absence from the manor, announced casually by Mr. Harrow the previous evening, during a chance encounter at the village shop, had set Miss Marple's instincts alight. "Gone to London," Mr. Harrow had said, his smile as polished as ever. But there was a tightness in his voice, a flicker of unease in his eyes that Miss Marple had not missed. London, indeed. A convenient excuse, she thought, for someone who did not wish to be found or someone who was no longer here to be found. She sipped her tea, the delicate clink of the cup against the saucer, the only sound in her quiet cottage. Her mind turned to Mrs. Bantry, her dear friend and confidant, whose knack for stumbling upon village intrigues was matched only by her willingness to assist Miss Marple in her discreet investigations. If anyone could help her gain access to the manor without arousing suspicion, it was Dolly Bantry, whose gregarious nature and position as the wife of Colonel Bantry granted her an almost unimpeachable excuse to poke about. Miss Marple rose from her chair. smoothing her skirt, and reached for her coat and hat. The morning was young, and there was no time to waste. Clara's disappearance, if it was indeed a disappearance, and not a voluntary departure, demanded investigation, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and knack for noticing what others overlooked, was precisely the person to undertake it. The walk to Bantry Hall was brisk, the air sharp with the promise of autumn. Miss Marple's stout shoes crunched against the gravel path as she passed the post office, where Mrs. Weatherby was already sweeping the steps, her eyes darting about for any tidbit of gossip. Miss Marple offered a polite nod, her face a mask of serene neighborliness, but her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. Mrs. Bantry was in her garden when Miss Marple arrived, her hands buried in the soil as she wrestled with a particularly stubborn weed. "Jane," she exclaimed, brushing dirt from her gloves and hurrying over. "You're out early. Is something afoot?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Perhaps, Dolly, I was hoping you might accompany me to the manor. I've a mind to offer Mr. Harrow some of my damson preserves, a neighborly gesture, you know." Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with understanding. She knew Miss Marple's neighborly gestures often concealed a deeper purpose. "Of course, Jane. Let me fetch my coat. I've been dying to see what's going on up there since I saw those cloaked figures the other night." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained unchanged. "Uncloaked figures, you say?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Bantry said, lowering her voice as if the roses might overhear. "I was out walking Lancelot too. Know how he insists on his evening stroll, and I saw them near the manor's gate. 2, perhaps 3, moving quickly. They didn't see me, thank goodness, but it gave me quite a turn." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her mind racing. Cloaked figures, a coded note. And now Clara's absence, it was all beginning to form a pattern, though the edges were still blurred. "We shall have to be careful, Dolly, very careful." The manor house loomed at the end of the lane, its stone facade imposing yet weathered, as if it carried the weight of secrets older than its current occupants. Mr. Harrow greeted them at the door, his charm as polished as ever, though Miss Marple noted the slight strain in his smile. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, what a pleasant surprise," he said, ushering them into the drawing-room. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Miss Marple held up the jar of damson preserves, her eyes twinkling with calculated innocence. "Just a small gift, Mr. Harrow. I thought you might enjoy a taste of St. Mary Mead's finest." "How kind," he replied, taking the jar with a nod. "You must stay for tea." Mrs. Bantry, ever the enthusiastic accomplice, launched into a cheerful monologue about the village's history, giving Miss Marple the opportunity to observe the room. The furniture was grand, but slightly worn, as if the manor had not been fully restored to its former glory. A faint scent of tobacco lingered, and a stack of papers on a side table caught her eye, papers that Mr. Harrow quickly moved to cover with a newspaper when he noticed her glance. "Tell me, Mr. Harrow," Miss Marple said, her tone light, "how is Miss Clara settling in? Such a charming young lady." Mr. Harrow's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Oh, Clara, she's gone to London for a few days. Personal matters, you know. She'll be back soon, I'm sure." "London," Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft but probing. "How sudden. I do hope she's well." "Quite well," Mr. Harrow said. "Now, about that tea." Mrs. Bantry, sensing the moment, leaned forward. "Mr. Harrow, might I trouble you for a tour of the manor? I've always admired its architecture, and Colonel Bantry was saying just the other day how he'd love to hear more about its history." Mr. Harrow hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Bantry, it would be my pleasure." As he led them through the grand hall, Miss Marple lagged slightly behind, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. The manor was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, some locked, others sparsely furnished. When they reached the upper floor, Miss Marple paused by a door left slightly ajar, catching a glimpse of a woman's shawl draped over a chair. Clara's shawl, she was certain, from the distinctive embroidery she had noticed during her first visit. "Dolly," she whispered, tugging at Mrs. Bantry's sleeve, "might you distract Mr. Harrow for a moment? I'd like to have a quick look." Mrs. Bantry, with the practiced ease of a seasoned ally, launched into a question about the manor's stained glass windows, drawing Mr. Harrow's attention. Miss Marple slipped into the room, her heart quickening despite her calm exterior. The room was unmistakably Clareza's small suitcase, half-packed, sat in the corner, and a vanity table held a few personal items, a hairbrush, a bottle of perfume, and tucked beneath a scarf, a torn photograph. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the photograph. It showed Clara, younger and smiling, standing beside a man whose face was partially obscured by the tear. The background was indistinct, but there was something familiar about the man's posture, the tilt of his head. She slipped the photograph into her pocket, her mind already racing with possibilities. Had Clara left willingly, or had someone forced her departure? As she scanned the room, her eyes fell on a wastebasket by the desk. Inside, crumpled but still legible, was a piece of paper bearing the same cryptic symbols she had seen in the coded note. She retrieved it, smoothing it carefully, and tucked it alongside the photograph. The symbols were unfamiliar, a mix of letters and numbers, but they confirmed her suspicion. Clara had been involved in something far more complex than a simple visit to London. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry's voice called from the corridor, tinged with urgency. "Mr. Harrow's insisting we see the library next." Miss Marple rejoined them, her face serene but her mind ablaze. The library was a grand room, lined with shelves that reached the ceiling, but it was the faint outline of a door behind one of the bookcases that caught her attention. A hidden room, perhaps. She filed the observation away, knowing she would need to return. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple spread the torn photograph and the crumpled paper on her dining table, her knitting abandoned for the moment. The photograph was a puzzle in itself. Clara's expression was joyful, but there was a tension in her posture, as if she were posing for someone she did not entirely trust. The man beside her, though partially obscured, had a distinctive ring on his left hand, a detail that tugged at Miss Marple's memory. Had she seen such a ring before? Perhaps in the village or during her visit to the manor. The coded note was even more perplexing. The symbols letters, interspersed with numbers and dashes, seemed to form a pattern, but without a key they were indecipherable. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to her nephew Raymond, whose fascination with ciphers might prove useful, but she hesitated to involve him just yet. This was a village matter, and she preferred to keep it close to home instead. She turned to her own resources, pulling an old notebook from her desk. Over the years, she had jotted down observations from her many little problems, as she called them, and among them were notes on codes, used by smugglers in a case from decades past. The symbols were different, but the structure, the way the letters and numbers alternated, felt familiar. Could this be a variation of a substitution cipher, perhaps one used by an organized group? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Bantry, her face flushed with excitement. "Jane, you won't believe this. I was talking to Mrs. Weatherby at the post office, and she says Clara was seen at the station the morning she supposedly left for London, but she wasn't alone. A man was with her, and Mrs. Weatherby swears he looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if he expected to be followed." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Did she describe him? Tall, dark coat, ando. Yes, she mentioned a ring. A heavy silver one, she said, with some sort of crest. The ring. Miss Marple's mind snapped back to the photograph. The man in the torn image had worn a ring, and now Mrs. Weatherby's description tied it to Clara's departure. This was no coincidence. "Thank you, Dolly," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but her mind racing. "This is most helpful." As Mrs. Bantry chattered on about the village's latest gossip, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the manor, to Mr. Harrow's evasive charm, and to Mr. Tate, whose brusque manner had struck her as more than mere rudeness. And then there was the coded note, the torn photograph, and now the sighting at the station. Clara had not gone to London willingly, Miss Marple was certain. But was she in hiding, or had something more sinister occurred? That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she watched the lights of the manor flicker in the distance. The village was quiet, but beneath its peaceful surface she sensed a current of danger. Clara's disappearance was the key, and the coded note, now safely tucked in her desk, was her next step. She would need to decipher it, and soon, for if her instincts were correct, the shadowy alliance mentioned in the cryptic letter was not just a threat to Clara, but to the entire village. The following day, Miss Marple visited the village. Seamstress Mrs. Price, whose keen memory for details often proved invaluable. Under the guise of discussing a new shawl, Miss Marple casually mentioned Clara's embroidered shawl, hoping to glean more information. Mrs. Price's eyes lit up. "Oh, that shawl. Clara came to me a week ago, asking if I could mend a tear. She was quite particular about it, said it was a family heirloom, mentioned something about the Grangers, to ask if I knew what had become of their son. Poor lad." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The Grangers were an old village family, their name tied to a tragedy years ago when their son Edward had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Could Clara be connected to them? The torn photograph, the shawl, and now this was all beginning to fit together, though the picture was still incomplete. "Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "did Clara say anything else about the Grangers?" "Not much," Mrs. Price replied, threading a needle with practiced ease. "Just that she'd heard stories about them in London, and she wondered if anyone in the village remembered. I told her the Grangers still live out by the old mill, though they keep to themselves now." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind buzzing. The Grangers, the photograph, the coded note, and Clara gone without a trace. She resolved to visit the Grangers' home, but first she needed to speak with Sir Henry Clithering. His knowledge of criminal networks might shed light on the coded note and the shadowy alliance that seemed to lurk behind every clue. The journey to Sir Henry's home in London was a calculated risk, but Miss Marple knew she could not unravel this mystery alone. She telephoned him that afternoon, her voice calm but firm. "Sir Henry, I need your advice on a matter of some urgency. Might I visit tomorrow?" "Of course, Jane," Sir Henry replied, his tone warm but curious. "What's this about?" "A puzzle," she said simply. "One that may involve more than just St. Mary Mead." The next morning, Miss Marple boarded the early train to London, the coded note and torn photograph carefully tucked into her handbag. Sir Henry met her at the station, his familiar face a welcome sight. Over tea in his study, she laid out the pieces of the puzzle: the cryptic letter, Clara's disappearance, the coded note, the photograph, and the rumors of nighttime visitors at the manor. Sir Henry listened intently, his brow furrowing as he examined the coded note. "This is no amateur's work, Jane," he said at last. "The symbols suggest a cipher used by organized groups, smugglers, perhaps, or worse. I've heard whispers of a syndicate operating in rural areas, using old estates as fronts. If Clara was involved, she may have stumbled onto something dangerous." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. "And the photograph, the man with the ring?" Sir Henry studied it closely. "The ring's distinctive. I'd wager it's a family crest, possibly tied to someone in the syndicate. If Clara was seen with this man at the station, it's possible he's the key to her disappearance." They spent the afternoon poring over the coded note, Sir Henry's expertise guiding Miss Marple through the basics of cipher breaking. By evening, they had made progress, deciphering a fragment that pointed to a meeting at the village hall on the following evening. "A charity event," Miss Marple said, her eyes gleaming, "the perfect cover for an exchange." Sir Henry leaned back, his expression grave. "Jane, this is dangerous. If this syndicate is what I think it is, they won't hesitate to silence anyone who gets too close." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then we must be cleverer than they are, Sir Henry." In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple prepared for the village hall event, her mind sharp with purpose. The charity bazaar was a village tradition, attended by nearly everyone, and it provided the perfect opportunity to observe Mr. Harrow, Mr. Tate, and any others who might be involved. She dressed simply, her hat adorned with a modest flower, and tucked the coded note and photograph into her purse, just in case. The village hall was ablaze with activity when she arrived, the air filled with the chatter of villagers and the scent of freshly baked scones. Miss Marple moved through the crowd, her eyes scanning for familiar faces. Mr. Harrow was there, charming as ever, chatting with the vicar. Mr. Tate stood by the refreshment table, his expression dour, his eyes darting about as if expecting trouble. And then she saw him, Mr. Ellis, the local shopkeeper, lingering near a side door. His hands were in his pockets, but Miss Marple noticed the bulge of something concealed, something that looked suspiciously like a package. She edged closer, her knitting bag a comforting weight on her arm, and watched as Mr. Tate approached. "Mr. Ellis," their exchange brief but tense. A package changed hands, and Miss Marple's heart quickened before she could move closer. The lights in the hall flickered and went out. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by a sharp, unmistakable sound. A gunshot. Screams erupted, and Miss Marple clutched her bag, her mind racing. When the lights returned, moments later, Mr. Ellis was gone, and the package was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple remained calm, her eyes scanning the crowd. Mr. Harrow was still with the vicar, his face a mask of concern. Mr. Tate was back at the refreshment table, his hands now empty, and the side door, where Mr. Ellis had stood, was slightly ajar. She slipped outside, her steps silent, and caught a glimpse of a figure disappearing into the shadows. It was too dark to be certain, but the gait, the nervous energy it matched Mrs. Weatherby's description of the man at the station. The man with the ring. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles moving rhythmically. As she pieced together the evening's events, the gunshot, the package, Mr. Ellis's disappearance, it all pointed to a larger scheme, one that Clara had likely stumbled upon. The coded note, now partially deciphered, confirmed the village hall as a meeting point, but for what? An exchange of goods, information, or something more sinister. She thought of Clara, her embroidered shawl, her connection to the Grangers. The torn photograph suggested a personal stake in this mystery, perhaps a family tie that had drawn her to St. Mary Mead. And the man with the ring, who was he, and why had he been with Clara at the station? Chapter 6. Sir Henry's Counsel. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. The cryptic note she had found in Clara's bag lay on the table before her, its strange symbols taunting her with their secrets. She had spent the previous evening poring over it, her sharp mind teasing out patterns, but the code remained stubbornly opaque. The letter that had arrived at her cottage days earlier, with its ominous mention of a shadowy alliance, weighed heavily on her thoughts. She knew she needed an ally of her own, someone with experience beyond the village's quaint borders. There was only one person she trusted for such a task, Sir Henry Clithering, retired Commissioner of Scotland Yard. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her movements deliberate but sprightly for her age, and crossed to the small writing desk by the window. The view of her garden, with its neatly trimmed roses and the first signs of autumn in the browning leaves, usually brought her calm. Today, however, her mind was too occupied for such simple pleasures. She penned a concise letter to Sir Henry, requesting his counsel and enclosing a carefully worded description of the note's symbols. Though not the note itself, she was too cautious for that. She sealed the envelope, slipped it into her handbag, and set out for the post office. The walk through St. Mary Mead was brisk, the air sharp with the promise of cooler days. Villagers nodded politely as she passed, their faces familiar yet tinged with the unease that had settled over the community since Mr. Harrow's arrival at the manor. At the post office, Miss Marple handed her letter to Mrs. Cleet, the postmistress, whose eyes lingered on the envelope's address. Sir Henry Clithering, is it? Mrs. Cleet said, her tone a mix of curiosity and respect. Haven't seen his name in a while. Trouble brewing, Miss Marple. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with practiced innocence. Just catching up with an old friend, Mrs. Cleet. Nothing more. Mrs. Cleet raised an eyebrow, but said no more, stamping the envelope with a thud. Miss Marple left the post office, her mind already turning to the next step. She needed to understand the manor's occupants better, Mr. Harrow's charm, Clara's nervousness, Mr. Tate's brusqueness, and now, with Clara's sudden disappearance, the stakes felt higher. The coded note, tucked safely in her knitting bag, was her only tangible clue, and she hoped Sir Henry could shed light on its meaning. 2 days later, a telegram arrived from Sir Henry, announcing his visit the following afternoon. Miss Marple spent the morning tidying her cottage, though it was already immaculate, and preparing a simple tea. She chose her best china, not out of vanity, but because she knew Sir Henry appreciated the small courtesies of village life. When his car pulled up outside her gate, she was ready. Her demeanor calm, but her mind racing. Sir Henry Clithering stepped out. His tall frame slightly stooped with age, but his eyes as sharp as ever. His gray suit was impeccably tailored, a contrast to the rustic charm of St. Mary Mead. He greeted Miss Marple with a warm smile, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who had spent decades unraveling mysteries. "Jane," he said, clasping her hand, "it's been too long. Your letter piqued my curiosity, I must admit." "Come in, Henry," Miss Marple replied, leading him into the parlor. "I'm afraid this isn't just a social call." "Over tea and scones," Miss Marple recounted. The events of the past week, the gossip about Mr. Harrow, the cryptic letter, Clara's disappearance, and the coded note. She produced the note from her bag, its crumpled edges smoothed out, and placed it before Sir Henry. The symbols were a mix of letters and numbers, arranged in no apparent order: K7 M3P 19 R8T. Below them, a single word was scrawled: Hall. Sir Henry studied the note, his brow furrowing. "This is no amateur's work," he said at last. "It's a cipher, likely a substitution or transposition code. The word Hall suggests a location, perhaps the village hall." Miss Marple nodded. "I thought the same. There's a charity event there tomorrow evening. It's the sort of place where people come and go without much notice. A perfect cover for something." Sir Henry leaned back, his fingers steepled. "You mentioned a shadowy alliance in your letter. That phrase has been floating around certain circles in London. There's talk of an underground syndicate operating in rural areas, smuggling, possibly, or worse. They use out-of-the-way estates to avoid attention. This manner of yours fits the bill." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind connecting threads. "Smuggling," she murmured. "I remember a case years ago in St. Mary Mead. A group of men used the old mill to hide stolen goods. It was all very quiet until one of them got greedy. Greed always betrays, doesn't it?" Sir Henry chuckled. "You haven't changed, Jane. Always seeing the patterns others miss. Tell me more about these Manor folk, Harrow, Tate, and the girl, Clara." Miss Marple described her visit to the manor, Mr. Harrow's polished manners, Mr. Tate's barely concealed hostility, and Clara's anxious demeanor. She lingered on the moment the note had fallen from Clara's bag, unnoticed by the others, but not by her. "Clara seemed frightened," she said, "not just nervous, but as if she were carrying a secret she couldn't share. And now she's gone. Mr. Harrow says she left for London, but I don't believe him." Sir Henry's expression grew grim. "If this syndicate is involved, Clara might be in danger, or she might be part of it. That note could be a message she meant to deliver, or one she intercepted. Either way, we need to crack it." They spent the next hour puzzling over the cipher. Sir Henry suggested it might be a book code, where the numbers and letters referred to pages or lines in a specific text, but without the key book, they were stuck. Miss Marple, however, had a different theory. "It's simpler than that," she said, her voice soft but certain. "In the village, people often use codes based on familiar things, dates, names, places. The numbers could be days or times, and the letters might stand for people or locations." Sir Henry raised an eyebrow. "You think it's a village code?" "Not quite," Miss Marple replied, her fingers tracing the symbols. But I think Clara wrote it in a hurry, using something she knew well. The word hall is the key. The village hall is where things are happening, or will happen. Sir Henry agreed to stay in St. Mary Mead for a few days, taking a room at the Blue Boar Inn to avoid drawing attention. He promised to contact a colleague at Scotland Yard who specialized in ciphers, hoping for a breakthrough. Meanwhile, Miss Marple planned to attend the charity event at the village hall, her instincts telling her it was no coincidence that the word hall appeared in the note that evening. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting idle in her lap. Her mind wandered to Clara, the young woman whose fear had been palpable. She thought of the torn photograph Mrs. Bantry had found in Clara's room, the face of an unknown man staring out from it. Was he part of the alliance, or someone Clara trusted? The photograph, like the note, was a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. The next morning, she visited Mrs. Bantry, who was eager to share the latest village gossip. "They're saying Clara ran off with a man," Mrs. Bantry said, her eyes wide. "But I don't believe it. She wasn't the type. And that scarf by the Rivero, Jane, it's too dreadful to think about." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand. "We mustn't jump to conclusions, Dolly. Clara may be in trouble, but she's clever. That note proves it. We'll find her." Mrs. Bantry looked unconvinced, but nodded. "What about Sir Henry? Can he help?" "He's already helping," Miss Marple said. "But we must be discreet. The alliance, whatever it is, has eyes in the village. We can't trust everyone." As the day of the charity event approached, Miss Marple prepared carefully. She chose a simple dress, unassuming but practical, and tucked the coded note into her handbag. She also brought her knitting, a habit that had served her well in moments of observation. People rarely suspected an elderly woman with needles and yarn, and Miss Marple used that to her advantage. The village hall was bustling when she arrived, its doors open to a crowd of villagers mingling over tea and cakes. The event was a fundraiser for the church roof, and the air was filled with chatter and laughter. Miss Marple took a seat near the back, her eyes scanning the room. Mr. Harrow was there, his smile as charming as ever. Chatting with the vicar, Mr. Tate stood by the door, his broad shoulders tense, as if guarding something. Mr. Ellis, the shopkeeper, was conspicuously absent. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Mr. Tate, his presence at the hall, so close to the word in Clara's note, was no coincidence. She noticed his eyes darting to the side entrance, where a group of men stood talking quietly. One of them, a wiry man with a scar on his cheek, seemed familiar, though she couldn't place him. Her memory, sharp as ever, filed the detail away for later. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her needles clicking softly. She overheard snippets of conversation, complaints about the weather, gossip about the manor, and a curious mention of a delivery expected at midnight. The word delivery pricked her ears, reminding her of Sir Henry's talk of smuggling. She made a mental note to share it with him later. Then, without warning, the lights in the hall flickered and went out. The room fell silent, broken only by a few gasps and nervous laughter. Miss Marple's grip tightened on her knitting needles, her senses alert. In the darkness, she heard a faint scuffle near the side entrance, followed by Chapter 7. The Village Hall Incident. The late summer sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the cobblestone lanes of St. Mary Mead. The village hall, A modest stone building with ivy clinging to its walls buzzed with anticipation. Tonight was the annual Charity Bazaar, a cherished event where locals gathered to raise funds for the church roof, exchange gossip, and indulge in homemade scones and tea. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and a neatly pressed blouse, adjusted her hat and stepped into the throng, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. The cryptic warning from the coded note, now tucked safely in her handbag, weighed heavily on her mind. It had hinted at a meeting tonight, here, in this very hall, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover its significance. The hall was a kaleidoscope of activity. Children darted between legs, clutching sticky toffee apples, while their parents chatted over cups of tea served by the Women's Institute. A small stage at the far end held a makeshift podium where Reverend Clement was expected to deliver a speech later. Miss Marple noted the familiar faces, Mrs. Price, the postmistress, fussing over her table of embroidered cushions, Dr. Haydock, arguing good-naturedly with a farmer about cricket, and Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a floral dress, organizing the raffle with military precision. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the newcomers. Mr. Tate, the brusque businessman from the manor, stood near the refreshment table, his broad shoulders tense as he scanned the room. Mr. Harrow, the manor's charming tenant, was absent, which struck her as odd, given his knack for ingratiating himself at village events. Miss Marple made her way to a table near the center, where she could observe without drawing attention. She purchased a jar of gooseberry jam from young Lucy Islesborough, a bright girl who helped at the manor and had a knack for noticing details. "Busy night, isn't it, Lucy?" Miss Marple said, her tone light but probing. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple," Lucy replied, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Everyone's here, though I thought Mr. Harrow might show. He's usually keen on these things." Her eyes flicked toward Mr. Tate, who was now speaking to Mr. Ellis, the village shopkeeper, in a low, urgent tone. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the interaction. Mr. Ellis, a wiry man with a perpetually anxious expression, ran the general store and was known for his frugality. His sudden involvement with Mr. Tate, a man of wealth and brusqueness, was curious. The coded note, which Sir Henry Clithering had partially deciphered, had mentioned a delivery at the village hall. Could Mr. Ellis be involved? Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her knitting bag, where the note lay hidden. She needed to stay alert. As the evening progressed, the hall grew warmer, the air thick with the scent of tea and lavender. Miss Marple sipped her Earl Grey, her eyes never straying far from Mr. Tate. He had moved to a corner near the stage, where he was joined by Mr. Ellis. The two men stood close, their heads bent together. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she saw Mr. Tate slip a small wrapped package about the size of a book into Mr. Ellis's coat pocket. The shopkeeper's hand darted to the pocket, as if to confirm its contents, before he nodded curtly and moved toward the exit. Miss Marple's mind raced. Was this the delivery the note had referenced? She needed to act, but discretion was paramount. She rose, feigning interest in a table of crocheted doilies nearby, and edged closer to the stage. The crowd was distracted by Mrs. Bantry's announcement of the raffle winners, and Miss Marple used the moment to slip behind a heavy curtain that separated the stage from a small storage area. From here, she could see the side door where Mr. Ellis was heading. She noted the door led to the alley behind the hall, a secluded spot perfect for secretive exchanges. Her suspicions deepened. The coded note had mentioned a shadowy alliance, and this clandestine handoff suggested Mr. Ellis was more than a simple shopkeeper. Before she could follow, the hall plunged into darkness. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by the clatter of dropped teacups and a child's wail. The lights had gone out, an unusual occurrence for the well-maintained village hall. Miss Marple froze, her senses heightened. Then a sharp crack split the air, a gunshot, unmistakable and chilling. Screams erupted, and the crowd surged toward the exits, their orderly chatter dissolving into chaos. Miss Marple gripped the curtain, her heart pounding, but her mind steady. She needed to find Mr. Ellis and the package. The lights flickered back on within seconds, revealing a disheveled crowd. Reverend Clement stood on the stage, calling for calm, while Mrs. Bantry ushered children toward their parents. Miss Marple scanned the room. Mr. Tate was still in his corner, his face pale but composed, his eyes darting toward the side door. Mr. Ellis, however, was gone. Miss Marple slipped through the crowd, her small stature allowing her to move unnoticed, and reached the side door. She pushed it open, stepping into the cool night air of the alley. The alley was narrow, flanked by the hall's stone wall and a row of bins. Moonlight cast long shadows, and Miss Marple's eyes adjusted to the dimness. She saw no sign of Mr. Ellis, but a faint scuff mark on the cobblestones caught her attention, a fresh scrape, as if someone had stumbled in haste. She followed the alley to its end, where it opened onto a quiet lane. There, in the distance, she glimpsed a figure hurrying toward the high street. It was Mr. Ellis, his coat flapping as he moved. The package was no longer in his pocket. Miss Marple was certain of it. Had he dropped it in the chaos, or had someone taken it? She returned to the hall, her mind piecing together the events. The blackout had been deliberate. She was sure, likely a distraction to cover the gunshot or the package's disappearance. But who had fired the shot, and why? No one appeared injured, which suggested the shot was a warning or a signal. Miss Marple rejoined the crowd, now settling under Reverend Clement's assurances that the blackout was a mere electrical fault. She caught Mrs. Bantry's eye and gave a subtle nod, signaling a need to talk later. As the bazaar resumed, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. She replayed the scene: Mr. Tate's handoff, Mr. Ellis's exit, the blackout, the gunshot. The package was key, but its contents were unknown. Was it stolen artifacts? As Sir Henry had suggested, the syndicate dealt in, or something more sinister? She recalled Clara's disappearance and the coded note's warning. The pieces were connected, but the puzzle was incomplete. Miss Marple approached Lucy Islesborough, who was tidying her stall. "Lucy, dear," she said, her voice gentle, "did you notice anything odd during the blackout? Perhaps near the side door?" Lucy frowned, thinking. "I was near the refreshment table, but I heard a scuffle by the stage. Someone bumped into me, and I thought I saw Mr. Ellis heading out. He looked nervous, like he was in a hurry." "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said, patting her arm. Lucy's observation confirmed her suspicions. Mr. Ellis had fled, but not before the package vanished. Had he been betrayed by his own allies, or was the blackout a ruse to steal the package from him? As the evening wound down, Miss Marple lingered, watching Mr. Tate. He stayed until the end, helping stack chairs with an air of nonchalance that didn't fool her. His eyes were too alert, his movements too deliberate. She noted he avoided the side door, as if distancing himself from the incident. When the hall emptied, Miss Marple slipped back to the alley, her torch casting a thin beam. She searched the cobblestones, hoping to find a clue, a dropped item, a footprint, anything. Near the bins, she spotted a torn scrap of paper, its edge singed as if by a spark. It bore a single word in hurried script: Granger. Miss Marple's breath caught. The Granger family, tied to Clara's torn photograph, had surfaced again. Was the package linked to their past tragedy? She tucked the scrap into her handbag, her resolve hardening. The shadowy alliance was unraveling, but danger lurked closer than ever. She needed to consult Sir Henry and devise a plan to draw the culprits into the open. The village clock struck 10 as Miss Marple walked home, her mind ablaze with theories. The charity bazaar had been more than a fundraiser. It was a stage for the syndicate's machinations. Mr. Ellis's flight, the missing package, and the gunshot were threads in a larger web. As she passed the manor, its windows dark, she wondered about Mr. Harrow's absence. Was he orchestrating from the shadows, or was he another pawn? Only to Mand her careful observation would tell. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. She spread the coded note and the singed scrap on her table, their words a challenge. The alliance was bold, operating under the village's nose, but Miss Marple was bolder. She would attend the manor's dinner, as Mr. Harrow had invited her earlier that week. It was the perfect opportunity to probe further, to watch Mr. Tate, and perhaps uncover Clara's fate. The village hall incident had been a warning, but Miss Marple was not one to be deterred. With a quiet smile, she began to plan her next move, her mind as sharp as the needles in her lap. The night deepened, and St. Mary Mead slept, unaware of the battle of wits unfolding in its heart. Miss Marple, however, was wide awake, ready to face the shadows. Chapter 8. Shadows of Motive. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair by the fire in her cozy cottage in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking softly as the flames cast flickering shadows across the room. The day had been one of quiet reflection, but her mind was far from idle. The events of the past weeks, the arrival of the enigmatic Mr. Harrow at the manor, the coded note that had slipped from Clara's bag, the strange figures moving about in the night, and now Clara's sudden disappearance had woven a tapestry of intrigue that demanded her attention. The firelight danced in her sharp blue eyes as she considered the players in this unfolding drama. Mr. Harrow with his polished charm, Mr. Tate with his brusque demeanor, and now Mr. Ellis, the local shopkeeper, whose abrupt flight from the village hall after the gunshot incident had raised more questions than answers. Outside, a chill autumn wind rustled the leaves in her garden, carrying with it the faint hum of village life winding down for the evening. Miss Marple's cottage, with its neat thatched roof and climbing roses, was a haven of order in a village that had recently felt anything but. She set her knitting down for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the soft wool, and reached for the cup of tea on the small table beside her. The warmth of the porcelain was comforting, but her thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of what she now suspected was a far-reaching conspiracy. The coded note, which she had retrieved from Clara's bag during her visit to the manor with Mrs. Bantry, lay folded in a small envelope on her writing desk. She had spent hours studying it, her keen mind teasing out patterns in the seemingly random numbers and letters. It was not fully deciphered. Sir Henry Clithering had promised to send it to a colleague at Scotland Yard for further analysis, but what she had gleaned so far suggested a meeting, a transaction, perhaps even a betrayal. The note was a clue, but it was the behavior of the players that told her the most. Mr. Harrow's easy smiles and carefully chosen words, Mr. Tate's barely concealed aggression, and Mr. Ellis's sudden disappearance all pointed to motives hidden beneath the surface. Of St. Mary Mead's tranquil facade, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a case from years ago, one that had unfolded in this very village. It had involved a blackmailer, a man who had seemed respectable to all, but had wielded secrets like a weapon, exploiting the fears and shame of his neighbors. The parallels were striking. Blackmail, she mused, was often the shadow cast by greed or desperation, and she suspected that the shadowy alliance hinted at in the cryptic letter she had received was rooted in something similar. But what was the currency of this alliance? Money, power, or something more tangible, like the package she had seen Mr. Tate pass to Mr. Ellis at the village hall before the blackout and the gunshot had thrown the event into chaos. The discovery of Clara's scarf near the river that morning had added a new layer of urgency. The village seamstress, Mrs. Price, had confirmed it belonged to Clara, noting the distinctive embroidery she had added at Clara's request. The scarf had been found tangled in the reeds by young Tommy Pierce, who had run to tell his mother, who in turn had told Mrs. Bantry, who had wasted no time in informing Miss Marple. The riverbank was a quiet spot, rarely visited except by children, fishing, or the occasional villager out for a walk. For Clara's scarf to be there, abandoned and mud-stained, suggested either carelessness or something far more sinister. Miss Marple did not believe Clara was careless. She rose from her chair, her movements deliberate but sprightly for a woman of her years, and crossed to the window. The curtains were drawn back, revealing the darkened village street beyond. The lights in the cottages opposite glowed warmly, but her gaze was drawn to the distant silhouette of the manor house, its chimneys just visible against the starry sky. What secrets did it hold? And why had Clara, who seemed so out of place among Mr. Harrow's polished circle, vanished so suddenly? Miss Marple's intuition told her that Clara was not in London, as Mr. Harrow had claimed. She was either hiding or someone was ensuring she stayed hidden. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed softly, marking the hour as 8:30. Miss Marple returned to her chair, picking up her knitting again as her mind continued to work. She thought of Mr. Ellis, the shopkeeper, who had always seemed such an unremarkable figure in St. Mary Mead. His general store was a hub of village gossip, a place where locals lingered over their purchases to exchange tidbits of news. Yet, in all her years of observing human nature, Miss Marple had learned that the most ordinary faces could conceal the most extraordinary secrets. Mr. Ellis's flight from the village hall, just as the mysterious package had vanished, was too convenient to be coincidence. Had he taken it, or had someone else seized the opportunity in the chaos? She recalled the moment at the charity event when the lights had gone out. The village hall had been crowded, the air thick with the scent of tea and freshly baked scones. Miss Marple had been standing near the back, her eyes fixed on Mr. Tate as he slipped the package to Mr. Ellis. It had been a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple's years of watching people had honed her ability to notice what others missed. The package had been small, wrapped in plain brown paper, and Mr. Ellis had tucked it into his coat with a glance around to ensure no one was watching. But Miss Marple had been watching. And then the sudden darkness, the gunshot, the gasps and shouts of the crowd did have all happened so quickly. When the lights returned, Mr. Ellis was gone, and the package was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the gunshot. No one had been injured, and no bullet had been found, which suggested it might have been a diversion. But a diversion for what? To allow Mr. Ellis to escape with the package, or to cover someone else's theft of it. She made a mental note to ask Mrs. Bantry if anyone had checked the village hall's fuse box. A deliberate blackout would require access, and that could narrow down the suspects. Her thoughts returned to Clara. The young woman had seemed nervous, out of place in the manor's opulent surroundings. The coded note, the torn photograph, and now the scarf by the river all pointed to Clara being more than just a guest of Mr. Harrow's. Miss Marple wondered if Clara had been drawn into something against her will, or if she had come to St. Mary Mead with a purpose of her own. The photograph, which Mrs. Bantry had described as showing Clara with an unknown man, was a tantalizing clue. Miss Marple had not yet seen it herself. Mrs. Bantry had promised to bring it to her tomorrow, but she suspected it held the key to Clara's true identity. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's mind turned to Mr. Harrow. His charm was undeniable, but it was the kind of charm that set her on edge, like a beautifully wrapped parcel that might contain something dangerous. He had been quick to dismiss Clara's absence, claiming she had urgent business in London, but his explanation had been too smooth, too rehearsed. Miss Marple had seen that kind of performance before, in men and women who had something to hide. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once remarked that the most dangerous people were those who could make you like them even as they betrayed you. Mr. Harrow, she suspected, was such a person. Mr. Tate, on the other hand, was all rough edges. His brusque manner and quick temper made him less adept at concealing his intentions, but that did not mean he was less dangerous. Miss Marple had observed him at the village hall, his eyes darting nervously as he handed the package to Mr. Ellis. There had been a tension in his posture, as if he expected trouble at any moment. Was he a subordinate, following orders, or was he a key player in this shadowy alliance? His aggression suggested a man under pressure, and Miss Marple knew that pressure could make even the most cautious people careless. The village itself was another piece of the puzzle. St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and predictable rhythms, was not the sort of place one would expect to harbor a criminal syndicate. Yet Miss Marple had long ago learned that evil could flourish anywhere, even in the most idyllic settings. The manor, with its high walls and secluded grounds, was the perfect place to conduct illicit business away from prying eyes. But why St. Mary Mead? What made this sleepy village a target for such a scheme? She set her knitting aside again and reached for her notebook, a small, leather-bound volume where she jotted down her thoughts. Flipping to a fresh page, she began to write in her neat, precise handwriting. Mr. Harrow, charming, evasive, likely the public face of the operation. Motive, unclear. Money, power. Mr. Tate, aggressive, nervous, possibly an enforcer or middleman, handed package to Ellis. Mr. Ellis, local shopkeeper, now missing, received package, fled after gunshot, central to Alliance. Clara, nervous, disappeared, connected to coded note and photograph, possible whistleblower or victim, package, contents unknown, stolen artifacts, money, key to Alliance's purpose, gunshot, diversion or warning. No injury, no bullet found. Clara's scarf, found by river, accident or staged. Chapter 9. A trail to the past. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea steaming gently on the side table, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered the latest developments. The discovery of Clara's scarf near the river had stirred the village like a pebble dropped in a still pond, sending ripples of speculation through the lanes of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as ever, turned over the threads of the mystery, each one leading her deeper into the past. The scarf, a delicate thing of blue silk with intricate embroidery, had been found by young Tommy Pierce, a lad known for his penchant for fishing in the river's quiet bends. He'd brought it to his mother, who recognized it as Clara's, having seen the young woman wear it during her brief stay at the manor. The news reached Miss Marple through Mrs. Price, the postmistress, whose knack for gathering gossip rivaled Miss Marple's own talent for observation. "Found it tangled in the reeds, they say," Mrs. Price had whispered, her eyes wide with the thrill of scandal. "Near the old willow by Granger's Bend. Queer place for a scarf to end up, don't you think, Miss Marple?" Queer indeed, Miss Marple thought, her needles pausing briefly. Granger's Bend was not a spot one stumbled upon by chance. The river there curved sharply, bordered by dense willows that hid the bank from prying eyes. It was a place of secrets, where village children dared each other to venture at dusk, whispering tales of ghosts and smugglers. She set her knitting aside and reached for her notebook, a small, leather-bound volume, where she jotted down the fragments of her thoughts. The Grangers had been a respectable family in St. Mary Mead, though their fortunes had waned over the years. Old Mr. Granger had been a solicitor, known for his meticulous records and quiet demeanor. His wife, Eleanor, was a gentle soul, fond of gardening and church bazaar. They had 2 children, a daughter, Margaret, who had married and moved to London, and a son, Edward, who had met a tragic end some 15 years ago. Edward's death had been a blow to the village, a young man of promise, lost to what was officially deemed an accident. Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she recalled the whispers at the time rumors of foul play, her movements deliberate despite the slight stiffness in her joints, and crossed to the window. The garden beyond was in full bloom, roses nodding in the breeze, but her eyes were distant, fixed on a memory. Edward Granger had been found at the foot of a cliff near the coast, some 20 miles from St. Mary Mead. The inquest had concluded. He'd fallen while walking, perhaps distracted or caught in a sudden storm. Yet Miss Marple remembered the unease that had lingered, the way Eleanor Granger's eyes had dimmed with unspoken grief, the way Mr. Granger had withdrawn from village life thereafter. There had been talk of debts, of Edward's involvement with unsavory characters, but nothing concrete had emerged. The scarf, Miss Marple mused, was no mere coincidence. Clara's connection to the Grangers was the key. and the torn photograph found in her room at the manor was another piece of the puzzle. She retrieved the photograph from her desk, where she had carefully stored it after her clandestine visit. With Mrs. Bantry, the image was faded, its edges frayed, but the faces were clear enough. A young woman, unmistakably Clara, standing beside a man whose features were partially obscured by the tear. Behind them, a familiar backdrop, the stone fountain in the Granger family garden, a relic of their once prosperous estate. Clara had been asking about the Grangers, according to Mrs. Threadgold, the village seamstress, who had mentioned the young woman's visit to her shop. She was ever so curious, Mrs. Threadgold had said, her needle pausing mid-stitch as she recounted the encounter to Miss Marple over tea, said she was tracing her roots, but her eyes were troubled, Miss Marple, like she was carrying a weight. Tracing her roots. Miss Marple turned the phrase over in her mind. The coded note, now tucked safely in Miss Marple's desk drawer, had hinted at a meeting, a plan to reveal something about the Shadowy alliance. If Clara was indeed a Granger, or connected to them, her disappearance took on a new urgency. Was she seeking justice for her brother's death, or had she stumbled upon something far larger, something that had drawn the attention of Mr. Harrow and his associates? Determined to pursue this lead, Miss Marple donned her hat and coat, a practical tweed that suited the crisp autumn air. She would visit Mrs. Threadgold again, this time with pointed questions about Clara's inquiries. The seamstress's shop was a hub of village chatter, second only to the post office, and Miss Marple knew that a casual conversation could yield more than an interrogation. As she stepped onto the cobbled lane, she nodded to Mrs. Price, who was sweeping the post office steps. "Off for a stroll, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Price called, her broom pausing. "Just a bit of fresh air," Miss Marple replied with a smile, her eyes twinkling with purpose, "and perhaps a word with Mrs. Threadgold about some mending." The walk to the seamstress's shop was pleasant, the village alive with the hum of daily life. Children played in the square, their laughter mingling with the clatter of a milk cart. The scarf, the photograph, the coded note all pointed to a connection with the Grangers. The retired commissioner's letter, received just yesterday, had confirmed her suspicions. A smuggling ring, operating under the guise of rural respectability, was using estates like the manor to move stolen artifacts. Could Edward Granger's death be linked to such a syndicate? And was Clara's disappearance a consequence of her digging into that past? Mrs. Threadgold's shop was a cozy affair, its windows adorned with lace, and its interior filled with the soft scent of lavender. The seamstress, a stout woman with nimble fingers, looked up from her work as Miss Marple entered, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure," Mrs. Threadgold said, setting aside a half-finished dress. "Come for that hem you mentioned, or is it something else?" "A bit of both, perhaps," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair near the counter. "I was thinking about that young woman, Clara, you mentioned, the one asking about the Grangers. Did she say anything specific about why she was interested?" Mrs. Threadgold's eyes narrowed slightly, her curiosity piqued. "Well, now that you mention it, she was quite particular. Asked about Edward Granger, mostly. The Grangers kept to themselves after Edward's accident, but Clara seemed to think there was more to it. She asked if Edward had any friends who might still be in the village, or if he'd ever mentioned a business deal gone wrong." Miss Marple's heart quickened. though her expression remained serene. "A business deal, you say? Did she mention what kind?" Mrs. Threadgold shook her head, her fingers absently smoothing a piece of fabric. "Not exactly. She was cagey, like she didn't want to say too much. But she did ask about a man named Ellis Meister. Ellis, the shopkeeper, said she'd heard he and Edward were friendly once. I thought it odd, seeing as Mr. Ellis is such a quiet sort now, keeps to his shop and doesn't mingle much." Mr. Ellis, the name sent a shiver through Miss Marple's thoughts. The shopkeeper had been at the village hall during the charity event, exchanging a package with Mr. Tate before the blackout and the gunshot. She thanked Mrs. Threadgold, promising to return for the hymn. Now abandoned, stood on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, its garden overgrown and its windows shuttered. Miss Marple decided to visit it, hoping to find some clue to Clara's purpose. The walk took her past the church, where Reverend Clement was tending to the roses. He waved her over, his face bright with curiosity. "Miss Marple, I hear you've been asking about the Grangers," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Sad business, that family. After Edward's death, they never quite recovered. Eleanor passed a few years later, and Mr. Granger moved away. The house has been empty since." "Did you know Edward well?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Not as well as some," the Reverend admitted. "He was a bright lad, but restless, always talking about making his fortune, getting out of the village. There was a time he was thick with Mr. Ellis, back when Ellis was new to St. Mary Mead. They'd meet at the pub, talk business. I never knew the details, but Eleanor worried he was in over his head." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. "And Clara, the young woman, from the manor, did she ever come to you, perhaps asking about the Grangers?" Chapter 10. The alliance revealed. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, curling around the hedgerows and draping the village in a soft, grey veil. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, a cup of tea steaming gently beside her, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Her mind, however, was far from the wool in her hands. The events of the past days, Clara's disappearance, the coded note, the gunshot at the village hall, had woven a tapestry of suspicion and intrigue that demanded her full attention. She had always believed that human nature was the same everywhere, whether in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead or the bustling streets of London, and now she was certain the shadowy alliance mentioned in that cryptic letter was no mere village gossip. It was something far darker, and she was close to unraveling it. She sipped her tea, her sharp eyes fixed on the garden beyond her window, where the roses were beginning to droop under the weight of the dew. The coded note, now safely tucked in her sewing basket, had been partially deciphered with Sir Henry Clithering's help. The retired Scotland Yard Commissioner had arrived in St. Mary Mead the previous evening, his face lined with the kind of weary determination that comes from years of chasing shadows. Over a modest supper at her cottage, they had pored over the note, its strange symbols and fragmented words hinting at a meeting that had already taken place at the village hall. But there was more to it, Miss Marple was sure. The note wasn't just a planet, was a warning, and Clara, the nervous young woman who had dropped it, was at the heart of it. Sir Henry had confirmed her suspicions about a larger operation. "There's been talk at the yard," he'd said, his voice low as he stirred his tea. "An underground syndicate moving stolen goods, artifacts, jewelry, even rare manuscripts through rural estates. They use the countryside as a cover, places where no one expects such things. Your Mr. Harrow might be a front, but he's not. The brain's too smooth, too polished. My money's on someone less obvious. Miss Marple had nodded, her mind already sifting through the faces she'd seen at the manor. Mr. Harrow, with his easy charm and vague answers. Mr. Tate, the brusque businessman whose eyes darted too often to the shadows. And Mr. Ellis, the local shopkeeper who had fled after the village hall incident. She had seen men like them before, in St. Mary Mead and beyond, men who hid their greed behind smiles or bluster. But Clara was the puzzle. Why had she come to the manor? Why had she vanished? And why had her scarf been found near the river, its bright red threads a stark contrast against the muddy bank? The clock on the mantel chimed 8, pulling her from her thoughts. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. Today was not a day for sitting idly. Sir Henry had promised to dig deeper into the syndicate's operations, using his old contacts at Scotland Yard. But Miss Marple knew that the answers lay closer to home. St. Mary Mead had its own secrets, and she intended to uncover them. By mid-morning, Miss Marple was walking along the high street, her black handbag swinging gently at her side. The village was stirring to life. The postman cycled past, whistling. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, was setting out trays of fresh scones, and a group of children darted across the green, their laughter echoing. To an outsider, it was a picture of rural tranquility, but Miss Marple saw the undercurrents, the glances exchanged, the whispers that stopped when she approached. The village was uneasy, and she knew why. She paused outside Mr. Ellis's shop, its windows shuttered since his abrupt departure after the village hall incident. The sign above the door, Ellis & Son, General Goods, was faded, the paint peeling at the edges. She recalled Mr. Ellis's nervous demeanor when she'd last seen him, his hands fidgeting as he handed her a tin of biscuits. He had always been a man of routine, predictable as the church bells, until that night. Why had he fled? And what was in the package he'd exchanged with Mr. Tate? As she stood there, Mrs. Bantry appeared, her cheeks flushed from a brisk walk. "Jane, you're up early, plotting something, I dare say." Her tone was teasing, but her eyes held a glint of curiosity. Miss Marple smiled. "Just taking the air, Dolly, though I was wondering about Mr. Ellis. It's odd, isn't it, how quickly he left after the charity event?" Mrs. Bantry's eyebrows shot up. "Odd, downright suspicious, if you ask me. I heard from Mrs. Price that he hasn't been seen since, and his wife claims he's visiting family in Devon." As if anyone believes that. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the torn photograph she'd found in Clara's room. It had shown Clara with a young man, his face half obscured but familiar somehow. The village seamstress, Miss Hart, had confirmed that Clara had asked about the Granger family, whose son, Thomas, had died years ago under mysterious circumstances. The photograph matched an old Granger family portrait Miss Marple had seen in the village archives, and she was beginning to suspect that Clara was no stranger to St. Mary Mead. Could she be a Granger? Perhaps a cousin or sister, seeking answers about Thomas's death. And could that death be tied to the syndicate Sir Henry described? "Dolly," Miss Marple said, lowering her voice, "do you recall the Granger boy's accident? It was years ago, near the river. They said he drowned, but there were whispers of foul play." Mrs. Bantry frowned. Her memory jogged. Yes, I do, poor lad. He was only 20, wasn't he? Found in the river after a storm. The police called it an accident, but old Mrs. Granger never believed it. She swore someone had pushed him. Miss Marple's lips pursed, and now Clara's scarf is found near that same river. I don't believe in coincidences, Dolly. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You think Clara's mixed up in something dangerous? That syndicate Sir Henry mentioned. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Clara knows more than she's let on, and I think Mr. Ellis does too. We need to find out what they're hiding and quickly. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in the vicarage with Reverend Clement, whose kind face was creased with concern. She had shared just enough to enlist his help without alarming him unduly. The vicarage was a hub of village news, and the Reverend, though absent-minded, had a knack for noticing things others missed. I've been thinking about the village hall, Miss Marple said, her knitting needles clicking softly. That blackout wasn't an accident, was it? Someone wanted to create confusion. Reverend Clement nodded. I've checked the fuse box myself. The wires were tampered with, Jane. Not cut, mind you, but loosened just enough to cause a flicker. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, and Mr. Ellis was there, wasn't he, handing something to Mr. Tate just before the lights went out. The Reverend hesitated. Well, yes, but Ellis is a churchgoer, a respectable man. Surely he wouldn't. Respectability, Miss Marple interrupted gently, is often a mask, Reverend. I've seen it before. A man can smile and still be a villain. She left the vicarage with a plan forming. If Clara was a Granger, her presence at the manor wasn't random. She had come to St. Mary Mead for a reason, perhaps to uncover the truth about her brother's death. The coded note suggested she had been trying to warn someone, perhaps the authorities, perhaps Miss Marple herself. But why had she vanished? Was she in hiding, or had something worse befallen her? By evening, Miss Marple was back at her cottage, awaiting Sir Henry's return. He arrived promptly at 7, his coat dusted with rain from a sudden shower. Over a pot of tea, he shared what he'd learned. The Yard's been tracking this syndicate for months, he said, his voice grim. They call themselves the Order of the Saffron Veil, of all things. Smugglers, mostly, dealing in stolen artifacts from private collections. They use rural estates as staging grounds, places like your manor house. Harrow's likely a front, as I thought. Tate's the muscle, handling the dirty work. But the real leaders, someone local, someone with roots in the community. That's how they stay under the radar. Miss Marple's needles paused. Someone local, she murmured. Mr. Ellis, perhaps. Sir Henry raised an eyebrow. The shopkeeper. He's on their list, but they thought he was small fry, a courier, maybe not the mastermind. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone neutral. But I've seen men like him before. Quiet, unassuming, always in the background. They're the ones who surprise you. She told him about Clara's scarf and the Granger connection. Sir Henry listened intently, his fingers drumming on the table. If Clara's a Granger, she might have stumbled onto something big, something that got her brother killed. That scarf by the river, it's almost too convenient. A plant, maybe, to make us think she's dead. Miss Marple nodded. I've been thinking the same. Clara's alive, I'm sure of it, but she's in danger, and we need to find her before the syndicate does. they spent the next hour planning. Sir Henry would contact his old colleagues at Scotland Yard, arranging for discreet surveillance of the manor. Miss Marple, meanwhile, would use her position in the village to gather more information. She had an idea, risky one, but necessary. If the syndicate was as cunning as Sir Henry described, they would need to be drawn out, exposed in a way that left no room for escape. Mrs. Price's eyes lit up. Clara, back already.